Good evening. It's really good to be here. It's great to be talking about gentleness because actually, gentleness is one of those things that doesn't get talked about. It's a bit like the stewarding of the fruit of the Spirit. It's the bit that you don't notice until it's missing. And this summer we've been looking, haven't we, at fruitfulness and at the different fruit of the Spirit. And yet, actually, when we look at the text, when we look at Galatians, Paul has a list, and they aren't easy asks, are they? In fact, it's quite a big effort to do just one of them just once a day, I find anyway. Love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. It's a tall order. But there's good news here. Because what we see Paul talk about is not the fruits of the Spirit in the plural, but the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is love. Everything else flows from that love. The fruit of the Spirit that Paul talks about, it's love, semicolon, and then all the rest of them. The fruit of the Spirit shouldn't read like a list of virtues that we kind of have to tick off. But they're facets of the same beautiful jewel, mined when we get to know Jesus better. And today we're turning to the facet of gentleness. We want to see what Jesus talks about. And it's perhaps not a word that comes to mind when we think of the King of Kings, the King of Heaven. But wonder, just 30 seconds, what comes to your mind when you think of gentleness? I'll pick on some people in a minute. Soft, calm, caring. They're the words we think of when we think of gentleness, aren't we? And I wonder if one of the images you kind of thought of is like fluffy and nice. Gentleness is nice, right? Well, we hit a snag, I think, when we just think about gentleness as niceness. Because I don't see a lot of bubble and fluff in Jesus. I don't see a lot of niceness. I see kindness, I see love, but I don't see a lot of niceness. He had some pretty harsh words for the Pharisees at times. There was that incident where he turned over quite a few tables. But what I've noticed as I've studied gentleness and studied Jesus this week is that whilst he doesn't always act meekly or mildly, he doesn't lose control. Even in his anger, he is measured. He turns the tables in his father's house when it's being misused. But he doesn't lash out. His emotions are raw and they're real. And they come from the heart of who he is. The writer of the Proverbs understood this, I think, years before Jesus was born. Proverbs 25, verse 15 says this: "A gentle tongue can break a bone." Gentleness isn't weakness. It's not soft and fluffy. It's not being a pushover, but it's being firm in whom we trust and who we follow. Gentleness is strength. And the word we use to translate gentleness from the Greek is prautes, which I think I might have said wrong. And it means a humble disposition to divine will. Gentleness is actually about doing God's will, submitting to it even when it's hard. Gentleness is strength, because gentleness is Jesus begging the Father to take the cup from him and yet still carrying his cross to Calvary. Gentleness is how Jesus describes himself as a reflection of the Father. In Matthew's Gospel, he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. What Jesus is saying here isn't that we will never feel burdened. It would be nice if he was saying that, but he's not. What he's saying is he will meet us in our weakness. He will meet us in our burdens with his gentleness. And I see this most clearly in Jesus' interaction with the Samaritan woman at the well, which is described in John's Gospel. So in John chapter 4, from verse 4, it's on page 1067 in your church Bibles. Now he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about the 6th hour. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his flocks and herds?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." He told her, "Go, call your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband." What you have said is quite true, sir," the woman said. "I can see that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." Jesus declared, "Believe me, woman, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming, and it has now come, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshippers must worship in spirit and in truth." The woman said, "I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Then Jesus declared, "I who speak to you am he." Just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with the woman. But no one asked, "What do you want?" or "Why are you talking with her?" Then leaving her water jar, the woman went back into the town and said to the people, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Christ?" This is the word of the Lord. It's an extraordinary encounter. It's extraordinary in its cultural significance, and it's extraordinary in what it reveals to us about Jesus. John takes great care here to tell us how Jesus was feeling at the time. He's tired and he's thirsty. Now, I don't know about you, but I am definitely not at my most gentle when I am tired. Some might even go as far to say that I can get a little bit grumpy. And I can't help but think that when Jesus went to that well, what he actually wanted was to sit down and a drink. He wanted a bit of peace and quiet. But gentleness looks with love. Gentleness looks at the person in front of us and puts our needs to one side a little bit. And that's what Jesus does. He initiates this conversation. And it's not with just anyone. This was a conversation with a woman who decided to draw water at the height of the heat of the day. It was a time most avoided. Women usually went to the well in the morning or in the evening when it was cooler. We probably did that a bit in the heat wave, didn't we? I know I did. If it was the heat of the day, I was inside, usually with 2 fans pointing in my direction. But what the timing of this woman's visit to the well tells us is that she doesn't want to be around other people. She's purposefully choosing the quietest time of the day to draw water. And in Jesus speaking to her, it's not just scandalous because she was a woman on her own, but because she was a Samaritan woman. Jews and Samaritans, historically speaking, did not get on. In fact, such was the animosity that amongst the Jews, they would call one another a Samaritan as an insult. The Jews thought that the Samaritans were heretical and racially inferior. They really weren't fans. This was a conversation that shouldn't have happened. And yet, in Jesus' gentleness, in his humility, he speaks to her heart, not her gender or her race. And her reply tells us quite how inappropriate what Jesus had done was. How can you ask me for a drink? This gentleness comes from seeing people as loved children of God, submitting to God's view of people rather than ours. And as Jesus begins to talk about this living water that would cause her never to thirst ever again, it looks as though her first thought is, brilliant, I won't have to come to this well in the heat of the day again. But Jesus perhaps is alluding to all the paths that she's been down that haven't given her satisfaction, that haven't given her significance. Maybe Jesus was pointing to the fact that only he could give her those things. Jesus was offering a living water that would satisfy everything she'd ever longed for. And Jesus wants her to understand this. So he says, "Where is your husband?" It's a reasonable question because it was so rare for a woman to be on her own. But it's a revealing question because Jesus knows full well she doesn't have a husband. In fact, the man she's living with isn't her husband, and she's had 5 husbands before. At this point, the Pharisees would have expected Jesus to condemn her. But Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus challenges her in love. Jesus' challenge points her to redemption. It points her back to him. This woman probably hadn't experienced a great deal of gentleness in her life. She was a reject and an outcast. It reminds me a little bit of how stuff often plays out on social media. I don't know if you've ever seen Christians argue on Twitter, but it's a terrifying thing to behold. Because what happens on Twitter is you're faceless. And so people say things to one another in ways they wouldn't dream of talking to each other face to face. On Twitter, so often, being right is far more important than the people that we're disagreeing with. Jesus' gentleness does something completely different. He doesn't debate with her how wrong her life choices have been. But he reveals her pain and her sin. It was probably shocking to her, and the conversation was certainly shocking to the disciples when they returned. I love how John puts this, that it's basically, they don't say anything, but the looks on their faces are speaking 1,000 words. Like, why on earth are you talking to this woman? Their unspoken disapproval underlines the audacity of Jesus' gentleness in speaking to her. And yet Jesus' gentleness does far more to draw her away from her sin than the rejection she'd experienced before. There's a lesson here, I think, isn't there? In the way we approach one another when we sin. Because gentleness doesn't mean that we just avoid it and don't point sin out. But it does dictate that we do it out of our love for people rather than our disdain. Galatians 6 says this: brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. Conviction of sin shouldn't leave us languishing in shame. It should point us to repentance and to Jesus. And it drives this woman who's been hiding from the world because of her sin to actively seek out people, to tell them that she's met a man who's told them everything she's ever done. Gentleness encourages. Christy Wimber puts this beautifully. She says, imagine the scars on this Samaritan woman. Imagine what she had had to push through in order to show herself to those who had rejected her before. The power of her encounter with Jesus was more powerful than the pain she had lived with all those years. The power of an encounter with Jesus is more powerful than any shame we might bring. And Jesus' gentleness encouraged confidence in a way that shaming her never could have. Because it tells us later in the passage that people came to faith through her testimony. And her testimony rested on the fact that Jesus was gentle with her. That he was the Messiah. And he does the same with us today. Jesus is gentle with us. When I was 19 in my first term at Bible college, I was, quite frankly, a bit of a mess. I had been utterly broken by mental illness and self-harm and an eating disorder. And I threw myself into life at uni in a way that it was how I thought I should be living. It was last chance saloon for me. And I felt a bit like Bambi. I was kind of stumbling around trying to work out how to do this life thing, but I kept mucking it up. But a few months into my first term, at a worship evening, a guy came over to pray for me, and something in me snapped. I was exhausted by trying to live this life that I thought I should. And the guy praying for me asked me if there was anything that was tethering me to my past, stopping me embracing actual life rather than this weird pseudo-life I was living. And I knew what it was. I had to start eating properly, taking care of myself. And it was hard. But Jesus was gentle with me. He surrounded me with people who saw through what I was going through, modeled to me what life could look like. They didn't chastise me when things went wrong, but they supported me until I could stand myself. Catherine Green McCreight, who is a writer, says that God's mercy means that the sun rises slowly. God's mercy means that the sun rises slowly. And I love that idea. It means that we are not torn from the night, but gently welcomed to the morning. God doesn't kick us when we're down or drag us kicking and screaming into the light. He leads us there with his gentleness. God can't do anything apart from gentleness because he is gentleness. Even in the way he created the world. At the time, there were lots of different creation stories kind of hanging around as there are today. And all of the other stories talked about the earth and humanity being created out of a fight, the result of a fight or a battle. But God speaks life. God pulled the earth out of chaos to create something new that he called good. Isaiah knew a bit about this, I think. And as he spoke to the broken and scattered Jews about the coming Messiah, he said this: "Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on the earth." It's a stunning picture of gentleness, but it's a very long way from idleness. Gentleness isn't about sticking to the status quo, allowing injustice to go unchecked. But neither does it trample over the weak to get its point across. We can all be a bit like that, can't we? Our point becomes more important than the people we're talking to. But Jesus models something that's not brute force, but justice. And if we can get to grips with how Jesus models gentleness in strength and encouragement out of his love for others, I wonder what practicing gentleness in our everyday lives might look like. Might change the way you challenge your colleagues, disagree with your partner, or discipline your children. Might it encourage you to be gentle with yourself? And in this coming week, it's my prayer that we all let the audacious gentleness of Christ be a sign that we are loved by him. Be a sign that points people straight to Jesus. Let it be how people know who we follow. I want to close with these few words from Colossians as an encouragement and a challenge as we go into this new week. It says this: "Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity."